This is not a question about who is winning anymore. It is not about how many missiles were launched last night or which leader made the strongest statement this morning. The real question, the one no one wants to answer directly, is far more unsettling. Can the United States actually get out of this war without triggering something even worse? Because if you look at what is happening right now, not through headlines, but through patterns we have seen over decades, a disturbing reality begins to emerge. The situation is no longer about strategy. It is about constraint. America is no longer choosing freely between options. It is navigating inside a narrowing corridor where every path carries a cost that may be impossible to accept. And that is what makes this moment different. In past conflicts, there was always a visible endgame, a clear objective, a defined victory. But here, the lines are blurred. The risks are interconnected, and every move seems to tighten the pressure rather than release it. What we are witnessing is not just another geopolitical crisis. It is a structural trap forming in real time. A trap where stepping forward risks escalation. Stepping back risks collapse of influence. And standing still allows the situation to spiral further out of control. The most dangerous part is that this is happening slowly, almost quietly, beneath the surface of daily news, while the consequences continue to build. And once that kind of pressure reaches a tipping point, history shows it rarely unwinds peacefully. At the center of this entire situation lies a reality that is often ignored because it is uncomfortable to admit. Once a war reaches a certain threshold, it stops being fully controlled by the people who started it. Leaders may initiate conflict, but they don't get to control how it evolves. The longer a conflict continues, the more it develops its own internal momentum, driven by pressure, perception, and irreversible cost. Every decision becomes heavier than the last because it is no longer just about what is strategically correct. It is about what is politically survivable. Walking away is no longer seen as a rational move. It is seen as weakness, as loss, as an admission that everything sacrificed up to that point was for nothing. And that is a psychological barrier that governments rarely cross. This is why wars that should end early often stretch into years, draining resources, damaging economies, and reshaping entire regions long after the original objectives have been forgotten. What makes the current situation even more complex is that this dynamic is now colliding with a second, more dangerous constraint, even if there is a desire to stop. The conditions required to stop may be strategically unacceptable. Any serious attempt to negotiate an end to this conflict would inevitably involve concessions that go far beyond the battlefield. It would require shifts in military presence, influence, and long-standing geopolitical arrangements that have defined regional stability for decades. These are not small adjustments. They are structural changes. And for a global power, accepting those changes does not just resolve a conflict. It redefines its role in the world. That is where the true trap begins to take shape. It is not simply that continuing the war is costly. It is that stopping it may carry consequences that are even more difficult to absorb. Now, this is where the situation begins to expand beyond a single conflict and reveal its true weight. because any major shift at this level does not stay contained. It triggers reactions across the entire global system. If the balance of influence in the Middle East begins to change, the first impact is felt by nations that have long depended on external security guarantees to maintain their stability. These countries are not passive actors. They are highly strategic, and their priority is survival. If they sense that the structure protecting them is weakening or becoming uncertain, they will adapt quickly, recalibrating alliances, opening new channels, and repositioning themselves in ways that ensure their long-term security. This is not betrayal. It is reality. And once that adjustment begins, it sends a signal far beyond the region. Financial systems, which depend heavily on stability and predictability, begin to react as well. Confidence is not just built on numbers. It is built on trust and continuity. If that trust is shaken, even gradually, capital flows shift, investment strategies change, and the underlying architecture that supports global economic stability starts to feel pressure. This is how geopolitical tension quietly transforms into economic consequence. But the chain does not stop there. In Asia, key allies begin to reassess their assumptions about long-term security. If they perceive that commitments can shift under pressure, they are forced to consider alternatives, including strengthening their own military capabilities and reducing reliance on external guarantees. That kind of shift does not happen overnight. But once it begins, it is difficult to reverse. At the same time, in Europe, where the cost of maintaining alignment has already been significant, the calculation may begin to change. If the perception grows that the current system is becoming less sustainable, then pursuing independent strategies, including reducing confrontation and stabilizing relations with opposing powers, becomes a rational option. And when multiple regions begin adjusting at the same time, what we are witnessing is no longer a regional crisis. It is the early stages of a systemic transformation that could redefine how power is distributed globally. If stepping back risks triggering a global shift and staying in place only increases pressure, the natural instinct is to push forward, to take decisive action that restores control and reshapes the narrative. This is where the escalation trap quietly takes hold. It often begins with something that appears limited, targeted, and manageable. A move designed to create leverage without expanding the conflict. But once that move is made, it immediately creates new vulnerabilities that must be addressed. A position that is taken must now be defended. A defensive posture requires broader coverage. That broader coverage exposes new fronts. And each new front demands additional resources, additional commitment, and deeper involvement. What started as a contained operation begins to expand, not because of a single decision, but because each step logically demands the next. This is how escalation works in practice, not as a dramatic leap, but as a sequence of necessary reactions that gradually remove the option of restraint. History has shown this pattern repeatedly, where initial objectives are overtaken by the need to sustain what has already been committed. And over time, the scale of involvement grows far beyond what was originally intended. And once a certain level of investment is reached, the cost of withdrawal becomes psychologically and politically harder to accept than the cost of continuing. Even when continuing no longer serves the original purpose. At the same time, there is another layer of reality that complicates this even further, and it lies in the nature of modern warfare itself. There is a persistent assumption that overwhelming strength can deliver fast and decisive outcomes. But that assumption no longer holds in the same way it once did. Today's conflicts are shaped by adaptability, by dispersion, and by the ability to exploit asymmetry. Opponents do not engage on equal terms. They avoid direct confrontation where they are weakest and instead operate in ways that stretch, frustrate, and complicate traditional military advantages. Technology has amplified this dynamic, making it possible to challenge even the most advanced forces without matching them directly. The result is a battlefield where dominance is harder to translate into resolution, where control is temporary, and where victory is no longer defined by speed or clarity. This does not mean that any one side is destined to fail, but it does mean that the expectation of a quick, clean outcome becomes increasingly unrealistic, and that uncertainty becomes the defining feature of the conflict moving forward. When you step back and look at all of this together, it becomes clear that this conflict is not an isolated event. It is part of a much larger shift unfolding across the international system. The tension we are seeing is connected to pressures in multiple regions, from trade disputes to security alliances to competing spheres of influence. What appears on the surface as a regional confrontation is, in reality, a reflection of a system that is being stretched in too many directions at once. When a global power is engaged across multiple fronts, each crisis does not just add pressure. It multiplies it. Resources are divided. Attention is fragmented. And the margin for error becomes smaller with every new commitment. This is how strategic overextension begins to reveal itself. Not through a single failure, but through the accumulation of strain across different arenas. And when that strain reaches a certain point, maintaining the existing structure becomes more difficult than adapting to a new one. That is why the real question is no longer how to manage one conflict, but how to navigate a changing world where the old assumptions about dominance, control, and influence are no longer as stable as they once were. This is where a deeper shift in thinking becomes necessary, not as a sign of weakness, but as a recognition of reality. A system built on unilateral control becomes increasingly difficult to sustain in a world where multiple powers have both the capacity and the will to assert their own interests. Adjusting to that reality does not mean abandoning influence. It means redefining how influence is exercised. It means moving from a model based on constant pressure and presence to one that prioritizes balance, negotiation, and shared stability. That kind of transition is complex and often uncomfortable because it requires letting go of familiar strategies and accepting a more distributed form of power. But it also opens the possibility of reducing long-term conflict by addressing the underlying causes rather than continuously reacting to the symptoms. In a world where every major decision now carries global consequences, the ability to adapt may be more valuable than the ability to dominate. So when you bring everything together, a clear an uncomfortable picture emerges. This is not simply a conflict that can be won, ended, or walked away from without consequence. It is a situation shaped by momentum, constrained by unacceptable trade-offs, and amplified by a global system already under pressure. Staying in the conflict drains resources and deepens uncertainty. Stepping out risks triggering wider instability. And pushing forward increases the likelihood of escalation that becomes harder to control. What we are witnessing is not just a war. It is a moment where the limits of power, strategy, and control are being tested at the highest level. And that is why this conversation matters. Not just for policymakers, but for everyone watching the world change in real time. If you found this breakdown helpful, take a moment to save this video so you can come back to it as events continue to unfold, and subscribe to the channel for clear, honest analysis that helps you understand what is really happening beneath the headlines. Because the truth is, the future is not fixed yet. Even in moments of tension and uncertainty, there is still space for better decisions, for smarter leadership, and for a shift towards stability that prioritizes people over power. And in the end, that is what will determine whether this moment becomes another prolonged crisis or the beginning of a more balanced and sustainable world.